Okay, let's unpack this. For decades, really, the whole promise of land reform in South Africa, fixing that painful legacy of colonialism and apartheid, it's just been stuck.
Completely stuck. And what our sources consistently point to is, well, expensive and protracted litigation. That's the phrase you see again and again.
Yeah, exactly. And you have people, often the most vulnerable, just waiting years, sometimes decades, caught in this incredibly fragmented legal system.
And that fragmentation, that complexity, the old system, even the post-94 one, just wasn't equipped for it. The mix of history, law, social justice, it was overwhelming. So the solution, or at least the attempt at one, is this, the Land Court Act 6 of 2023.
Right. And this isn't just shuffling deck chairs, is it? This feels like a serious attempt to actually speed up land reform, but crucially in a lawful and fair way.
That's the stated aim. It establishes this new specialized land court. And, while the key dates are assent in September 2023, commencement mostly April 2024.
Although some bits are still waiting, right? Section 37, some schedule items.
Correct. Important ones relating to regulations and specific amendments. But the main takeaway now is this commitment to a specialized, hopefully well-resourced judicial structure.
And it seems designed to tackle those past failures head-on. The goal feels like, well, transformative social justice.
It does. So our mission today really is to dig into this act, cut through the legalese and figure out what powers this land court actually has and how it's supposed to finally deliver land justice without, all that red tape we've seen for decades.
Okay, so if speed and justice are the goals, let's start at the foundation. We know the Constitution talks about land rights, equitable access, but we had structures before that didn't quite deliver. What specific constitutional drivers forced Parliament's hand here? Why a whole new court?
Well, it really comes down to two big constitutional promises that weren't being fully met. First, Section 25, the state's duty to enable access to land equitably and, crucially, to redress past racial discrimination.
The restitution part, getting the land back, essentially.
Exactly. And that process, as we know, has been incredibly slow, 30 years slow. And the second promise is Section 34, the right to have disputes resolved fairly in public before a court. But if that hearing takes, say, 10 years just to get started because the courts are overloaded and not specialized,
then the promise of fairness feels a bit empty.
Precisely. So this act is basically Parliament saying, okay, we need specialization to actually make good on these constitutional mandates.
So Section 2, subsection 1 lays it out clearly.
Right.
Enhance access, promote reform, facilitate justice. That's the purpose. But having a purpose is one thing. How does the act actually set up the machinery to do it?
Right. So Section 2, subsection 2 details the objects. It does three main things. Establishes the specialized court, sets up a dedicated appeal process just for it, and this is really important, it provides specifically for mediation.
Mediation.
Yeah.
Trying to solve things outside the courtroom.
Exactly. The whole design pushes away from that slow, expensive general high court route towards something specialized, accessible, and hopefully faster.
Let's look at the establishment itself then, Section 3. Because this isn't just tweaking the old land claims court, is it? It's something more.
It's definitely more. It establishes the land court as a court of law, yes, but also, and this is key, for restitution matters as a court of equity.
Equity. That sounds quite academic. What does that mean practically for someone making a claim?
It's actually hugely practical. A standard court of law applies statutes, precedents. It's very focused on the letter of the law. A court of equity, though, has more flexibility. It can look at what's fair, what's just in the specific, often unique circumstances of historical dispossession.
So it can be a bit more creative in finding solutions, less bound by rigid rules.
That's the idea. It allows for more tailored remedies, taking into account the historical injustice. And, importantly, the Act makes it clear. This is a superior court, Section 3, subsection 2.
Meaning
it has the same standing, the same inherent powers as a division of the High Court for the matters it deals with. It's not a lower body. It's top-tier judicial power focused purely on land.
And the judges themselves reflect that focus. Because that was a criticism of the old system, that judges maybe didn't have the deep background needed.
Yes, that's explicitly addressed. Section 8, subsection 4. The judge president, the deputy, all the judges. They must have expertise in land rights matters based on their training and experience.
So you can't just parachute in a judge from, say, tax law.
Not if the system works as intended. They need specific land rights knowledge.
Okay, but then there's the practical side. Expertise is great, but courts are usually in big cities. Johannesburg is the main seat here. How does this act help someone in a remote rural area get their case heard. That's always been a huge barrier.
That's a critical point, and the Act tries to tackle it directly. Yes, the main seat is Joburg, but Section 6 allows the judge-president to hold sittings anywhere else if it's expedient or in the interests of justice.
So flexibility.
But more than that, there's a mandatory part in Section 7. The minister has to, in consultation with the Chief Justice, set up places for sittings other than the main high court locations. And the reason given, explicitly, to make the court accessible to the people.
Wow, okay, so it's actually written into the law that the court has to go to the people, not just expect people to come to it.
Exactly. It recognizes where these disputes actually happen, often far from urban centers, and the court has jurisdiction across the whole country, effectively.
That feels like a genuine attempt to break down those physical, geographical barriers, which leads us from structure to how it actually works day to day. How does this court operate differently to achieve that promised speed and fairness?
Right. If the goal is acceleration, what procedural changes make that happen? Probably the most significant innovation is around evidence, especially for those historical restitution claims.
Because that's always the hurdle, isn't it? Proving something that happened decades ago, often without any written records. Standard courts need documents, titles, contracts.
Which often just don't exist for dispossessions under apartheid or colonialism. So, Section 21 introduces special rules of evidence specifically for Restitution Act claims. The land court can admit evidence, crucially including oral evidence, if it thinks it's relevant and cogent.
Even if?
Even if that same evidence wouldn't normally be admissible in another court.
Okay, let's pull that apart. Oral evidence. So things like family history, stories passed down about how the land was lost.
Potentially, yes. Hearsay evidence about the dispossession or about the community's own rules for land back then. The Act also specifically mentions allowing expert evidence, historians, anthropologists.
People who can provide that context.
Exactly. Now, the court still decides how much weight to give this evidence. It's not a free-for-all, but it widens the scope of what counts as valid proof in these unique historical cases.
That makes sense. You need historical tools to address historical injustice. Alongside evidence, you mentioned mediation being prioritized.
Very much so. It's woven into the process. Section 13 allows the judge-president to refer a case for mediation right at the start, before a hearing. And even if proceedings have begun, Section 29 lets the presiding judge order mediation if it looks like an issue could be resolved that way.
Trying to avoid the full-blown trial if possible. And presumably, to make mediation work, people need to feel they can speak freely.
Absolutely critical. And Section 29, subsection 8 addresses that. Anything said, any disclosures made during mediation are privileged, confidential.
Meaning it can't be used against you later if the mediation fails and it goes back to court.
Correct, unless both sides agree otherwise. It encourages open discussion, compromise, without fear of repercussions in the formal hearing.
Okay, special evidence rules, emphasis on mediation. What about the court's actual powers? Land disputes can get messy, touching on all sorts of legal areas, admin law, constitutional points.
Yeah, and the Act gives the land court really broad powers to handle that complexity. Section 24 is key here. Besides the usual high court powers like contempt orders or interdicts, it can decide any issue that's sufficiently connected to a land matter before it.
Even if that connected issue wouldn't normally be heard by the land court.
Yes, if it's in the interests of justice to deal with it altogether.
So it stops that bouncing between courts, trying to resolve one dispute that involves, say, a land claim, an eviction notice, and a water rights issue all at once.
That's the goal, streamlining, keeping the whole entangled matter in one specialized forum. And its powers to grant relief, the actual orders it can make under Section 26, are also quite specific and tailored.
It's not just about awarding money, then.
No, far broader. Section 26.3 lists things like actual restoration of the land, granting rights in alternative state land, compensation payments, sure, but also inclusion in state support programs like housing or rural development aid.
Practical, real-world solutions.
Trying to be. And there's a specific safeguard for community claims in subsection 4. Any order involving community land or compensation has to ensure fair, non-discriminatory access and proper accountability within that community.
That's important. Prevents elite capture within the community itself. One last crucial point on procedure. Legal help. All these specialized rules are great, but useless if people can't afford a lawyer to navigate them.
Absolutely vital. And Section 16, subsection 4, provides a safety net if someone can't afford representation and the court thinks they need it.
Which in these complex cases, they probably often do.
Right. Then the court must refer the matter to Legal Aid South Africa, and Legal Aid is then obliged to provide help at state expense if, and this is the test, substantial injustice would otherwise result.
So there's a mechanism to ensure access to justice isn't just theoretical, but includes legal representation.
That's the intention. It's baked into the act.
Okay, so we've seen the structure, the procedures, but where does this act really show its impact? You mentioned consolidation earlier.
Yes, that's perhaps the biggest structural change. Section 36 and the schedule attached to the act basically perform major surgery on South Africa's land law landscape. It amends or repeals sections of 8 key laws.
8. Wow.
And the core effect is consolidation. It officially dissolves the old land claims court, transfers all its pending cases to this new land court, essentially creating one central judicial hub for land matters.
So which specific areas or acts are now funneled into this land court? Can you give us some examples to show the scope?
Sure. Obviously, the big one is the Restitution of Land Rights Act in 1994. The land court is now the court for those claims. Then there's the Land Reform Labor Tenants Act from 1996. Disputes under that act, which used to be spread out, are now largely centralized here.
Including applications that used to go to the Director General first.
Yes, certain types, like Section 18 applications, now come to the court. And critically, the Extension of Security of Tenure Act 1997 ESTA.
That's the one protecting farm dwellers and workers against unfair eviction. Hugely important.
Hugely. Now, eviction orders under ESTA can be handled by the land court or a magistrates court. But, and this simplifies things significantly, civil appeals from the magistrates court in ESTA cases go directly to the land court.
Not bouncing up through the regular high court system first?
No, straight to the specialized land court. And it also takes over key jurisdiction under laws like the Communal Property Associations Act and the Interim Protection of Informal Land Rights Act.
So it really becomes the go-to judicial body for almost every major land dispute arising from post-apartheid legislation. Historical claims, labor tenant issues, tenure security, communal property governance. It's all under one roof now.
Pretty much it's a massive consolidation of jurisdiction.
And what about appeals from the land court itself, if someone disagrees with its decision?
That's covered in Section 31. It's also streamlined. If it's a decision by a single land court judge, the appeal goes either to a full court, which means 3 judges of a land court itself, or directly up to the Supreme Court of Appeal, depending on the direction given.
So you keep that land expertise involved in the first level of appeal?
Often, yes, with the full court option. And then appeals from that full land court go to the Supreme Court of Appeal, as you'd expect. It maintains judicial oversight, but keeps the specialist focus where possible.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what we've seen is the creation of a truly specialized superior court. It's constitutionally driven, equipped with unique tools like flexible evidence rules and mandated mediation, all designed to, hopefully, break the logjam and speed up land justice. It's a fundamental reshaping of how these critical disputes are handled.
Absolutely. The structure is there, the powers are defined, the intent seems clear, but, the proof is always in the pudding. Let me leave you and our listeners with maybe one final thought to chew on, something related to implementation that we haven't really touched on. The Act, in Section 12, allows the court to sit with assessors. Now, these aren't lawyers. They're described as people with relevant non-legal skills, experience, or knowledge. Think community elders, agricultural specialists, historians, perhaps. The regulations for appointing them are still pending under Section 37. But consider this. How might the actual use of these non-legal assessors bring in that deep contextual community-level knowledge right into the courtroom alongside the judge? How might that fundamentally change the dynamic? Could that be a key factor in not just speeding up decisions, but making them feel more grounded, more legitimate, and ultimately more just? That's the space to watch, I think, how those assessors are chosen and how they influence the court's work and practice.